The Royal Guards were a group of elite soldiers whose sole duty was to protect the monarchy, often seen standing motionless, gazing straight ahead with a calm, unyielding expression. Their purpose was simple: to uphold tradition, maintain the integrity of the royal family, and give a sense of stability to the public. But beneath the polished uniforms, the sharp, unwavering discipline, and the silent routine, there was more than met the eye. Among them was Corporal James Whitlock, one of the finest guards to ever serve. He had joined the Royal Guard straight out of the military academy, where he had proven himself as an exceptional soldier. Years of service had shaped him into a model of stoicism and unflinching resolve. His posture was impeccable, and his gaze never wavered. No matter how intense the heat, the cold, or the demands of the duty, he was often regarded as a living embodiment of the Guard's reputation for perfection. When people looked at James, they saw only strength, discipline, and a sense of duty that was nearly impossible to challenge. But what few knew was that behind the stern face and rigid body, James had a story, a life full of battles, both on the field and within his own heart. He had lost a brother in a conflict many years ago, and ever since, he had sworn an oath to protect those who could not protect themselves. His grief was hidden well beneath the unspoken promise he made to himself and to his fellow soldiers. Never let the world see weakness. In the world of the Royal Guard, weakness was a luxury no one could afford. In the same unit, there was Private Liam Carter, a young soldier who had only recently joined the Royal Guard after serving in a number of grueling overseas deployments. Liam had seen things no one his age should have witnessed, things that stayed with him long after the dust of battle had settled. Unlike James, Liam wasn't accustomed to the rigid discipline of the Royal Guard, and though he understood the importance of his role, he wasn't sure if he was truly ready for the expectations that came with it. Liam was only 22 years old, but the weight of his experiences made him feel much older. He had lost close friends, seen comrades fall in battle, and been exposed to violence and suffering that he couldn't forget. Every night, he would close his eyes, and the memories would flood his mind. Some vivid and sharp, others hazy and distant. But all of them felt too real. His soul was burdened with grief, guilt, and confusion, and though he tried to hide it behind his uniform, the cracks in his armor were becoming more evident every day. The first time James saw Liam in action, he was struck by the boy's sincerity. There was something raw about him, something vulnerable beneath the tough exterior. But at the same time, James saw the potential in him, the possibility that with the right guidance, Liam could become one of the best soldiers the Royal Guard had ever seen. James knew that it wouldn't be easy. The Guard wasn't just about standing still in perfect formation. It was about discipline, loyalty, and a commitment to an ideal that transcended personal emotions. Liam, on the other hand, found himself struggling to fit in with the strict, almost robotic routines of the Royal Guard. The idea of being emotionless, of hiding every trace of personal feeling behind the uniform, was something he found difficult to accept. He wasn't like James or the other guards. He didn't have the ability to shut off his emotions, to ignore the deep pain that haunted him every day. Instead of feeling pride in the Guard's traditions, he felt suffocated by them, trapped in a cycle of expectations that only seemed to get more demanding with each passing day. One chilly morning, during one of their routine parades, something happened that none of them would forget. The soldiers stood at attention, ready to perform their duties with the precision that was expected of them. The crowd stood in awe, watching as the royal procession passed by. But for Liam, something was different today. He had spent weeks trying to get his act together, to fit in with the flawless machine that was the Royal Guard. But as the sound of marching footsteps filled his ears, something triggered in him. The noise reminded him too much of the sounds of war, the sudden blasts, the chaos of battle, the screams. It was as though his mind was back on the front lines. And for a moment, he couldn't tell the difference between the past and the present. Liam froze, his body still, but his heart racing. He stood there, unable to move, unable to do anything, except remember the horrors he had tried to bury. His breath became shallow, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He knew he couldn't break rank, that doing so would be a violation of every rule he had sworn to uphold. But the fear, the terror, was too much to bear. It was like being trapped in a memory, caught between the world of the living and the ghosts of the past. James, who stood beside Liam, noticed the young soldier's sudden tension. The change was subtle, but it was enough for someone like James to pick up on it. He didn't let his gaze shift for a second, but his mind raced. What had caused this? Why was Liam shaking? The guards were trained to remain expressionless. But in that split second, James's eyes flickered with concern. He couldn't explain why, but he felt a strange sense of protectiveness toward the young soldier. It wasn't part of the job description to care for others, to show emotion or compassion. But in that moment, something inside James shifted. Something that made him wish he could reach out and help Liam. To tell him it was okay to feel, even if only for a second. The rest of the parade went on without incident, but James couldn't forget what he had seen in Liam. He knew the boy wasn't okay, that something deeper was eating at him, something he couldn't just shake off with a few hours of training or a few weeks of routine. That night, as they sat together in the barracks, James found himself watching Liam in silence. The young soldier was staring out the window, lost in his thoughts. He seemed far away, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely, reliving things he didn't want to think about. James had been through enough pain to recognize when someone was struggling. He had seen it in the eyes of his fellow soldiers, had felt it in the way they moved, the way they spoke, or rather, the way they didn't speak at all. The weight of their burdens was carried silently, never shared, never addressed. But something told James that Liam couldn't carry this weight alone. Maybe he didn't need to. Maybe, for once, it was okay to break the rules. To show that the Royal Guard wasn't just a symbol of strength, it was a human institution, made up of people who, like anyone else, had feelings, fears, and wounds that needed healing. The next day, as they prepared for their next duty, James found himself looking at Liam once again. The young soldier was still struggling, trying to maintain his composure. But James could see the cracks in his armor, and in that moment, he knew that he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. The days following the incident during the parade were long and silent. James kept a close eye on Liam, though he didn't let on that he had noticed the younger soldier's struggle. He knew it wasn't his place to confront Liam directly. After all, the Royal Guard was built on the idea of personal responsibility, and every soldier was expected to maintain their composure. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was weighing heavily on Liam's shoulders. For the next few days, Liam seemed to retreat into himself more and more. He followed orders, stood tall during ceremonies, and kept up appearances like any other soldier. But there was a noticeable distance in his eyes. When he wasn't on duty, Liam spent his time alone, sitting in the barracks, staring out the window, or walking the grounds without saying a word to anyone. The lively conversations and camaraderie that existed among the other soldiers never seemed to reach him. He was always lost in his thoughts, his face, more often than not, etched with worry and confusion. James, ever the watchful leader, began to notice subtle changes. At first, it was just little things. Liam's posture wasn't as rigid as usual. His eyes would wander, and he often seemed distracted. But then, during one particular morning drill, it became more apparent. The soldiers were tasked with standing in formation for several hours, a routine that required impeccable discipline. For the most part, every guard stood motionless, their eyes fixed ahead, their bodies stiff with concentration. But as the hours wore on, James saw Liam's hands trembling slightly. His face, once calm, now had a thin layer of sweat on it. He was trying, desperately trying, to keep his composure. but it was clear that the weight of something was slowly pulling him under. It was during a break in the training that James saw something that made him pause. Liam had gone to the back of the formation, away from the rest of the guards, and was standing there, breathing heavily. His head bowed. James, though remaining a few steps behind in his usual position, couldn't ignore the way Liam's chest rose and fell, as though he were struggling to regain control. The young soldier was on the verge of breaking, and James knew it. Liam tried to pull himself together, but it wasn't working. The anxiety was too much, the pain too deep. It wasn't the drills or the long hours that were getting to him. It was the memories that kept flooding back, the sights, sounds, and smells of the battlefield that would never leave him. He had tried to suppress those feelings when he first joined the Guard, thinking that once he was in a more structured, disciplined environment, he could leave his past behind. But the truth was, he had never truly left it behind. The war followed him in every corner, in every shadow. James, sensing that Liam was about to falter completely, did something that surprised him. He broke character. For a brief moment, he stepped out of formation, walking calmly toward Liam. He didn't say a word, but his presence alone seemed to reassure the younger soldier. The other guards barely noticed, lost in their own training, but for James and Liam, it was a moment of silent understanding. Liam looked up at James, his face flushed with embarrassment, his eyes filled with guilt. "I'm sorry, Corporal," he muttered, trying to regain his composure. "I can't." But James shook his head gently, placing a firm hand on Liam's shoulder. "It's okay," he said quietly, his voice low but filled with a quiet strength. "You don't need to apologize. We all have our moments." Liam didn't know how to respond to that. In all his time in the military, he had never heard a superior speak to him in such a way, with such kindness. The Royal Guard was known for its strictness, its unbending rules, and its unwavering focus on duty. James, however, had shown him something else, a side that was rarely seen, especially not in the form of a seasoned officer like him. For a few moments, they stood there in silence. Liam was too ashamed to look James in the eye, but the older man's hand on his shoulder gave him a sense of comfort, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as though, for the first time, someone understood what he was going through. When James finally spoke again, his voice was calm but firm. "Listen, I know it's tough. I know it's not easy to leave the past behind. But you're not alone in this, Liam. We're all here for each other. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself." Liam nodded slowly, the weight on his chest feeling just a little lighter. It wasn't a cure-all, and he wasn't suddenly free from the demons of his past. But in that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. The rest of the day passed without incident. But Liam couldn't stop thinking about what James had said. He had always believed that being a soldier meant keeping everything inside, never showing weakness. But now, a seed of doubt had been planted in his mind. Perhaps the Royal Guard wasn't just about discipline and strength. Perhaps it was about something deeper. Perhaps it was about supporting one another, about being there for each other in times of need. The following days were difficult for Liam. He struggled with the overwhelming sense of guilt and anxiety that plagued him. But at least he knew he wasn't alone. James's words echoed in his mind every time the pressure built up inside him. "We're all here for each other." Those words became a lifeline for Liam, a reminder that there was more to life than just the weight of duty. Those words, "We're all here for other." He wasn't just a cog in the machine. He was part of something bigger, something that cared for its own. Meanwhile, James went about his duties with his usual stoic demeanor. To the rest of the Guard, he appeared as unshakable as ever, his expressions neutral and his movements precise. But inside, something had changed. He had seen a vulnerability in Liam, and it had reminded him of his own past, of his own losses. In some ways, he could relate to the young soldier's pain. He had buried his own grief long ago, locked it away deep inside, believing that he could protect others if he didn't let his emotions get in the way. But seeing Liam struggle reminded him that even the strongest soldiers need help sometimes. As the days passed, James began to look at his role as a mentor in a new light. He wasn't just there to teach discipline and protocol. He was there to help his fellow soldiers heal, to guide them through the hard times, just as he had tried to do with Liam. The Guard was about more than just duty. It was about understanding, compassion, and unity. James had learned that lesson the hard way. But now, he was passing it on to the next generation of soldiers. Liam's recovery wasn't immediate. It took time, patience, and understanding. But slowly, he began to regain his footing. He still had bad days, days when the memories of war would rise up and threaten to take him down. But now, when those moments came, he would remember James's quiet strength and the bond they shared. He knew that he didn't have to carry his burden alone. And for the first time in a long while, Liam felt a glimmer of hope. The days turned into weeks, and the weather grew colder as winter settled over the palace grounds. The royal guard, as usual, stood firm in their ceremonial duties, their faces stoic and their movements precise. But behind the polished armor and formal uniforms, the soldiers began to carry something heavier than just their equipment, something unseen, but felt deeply by those who had eyes to see. For Liam, the days since the moment he broke down during the parade had been a mix of emotional highs and lows. James had shown him a side of the Guard that he hadn't expected, the compassion and understanding that went beyond the strict routines. But even with that reassurance, the weight of his past didn't disappear. It was always there, lingering in the background, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Liam did his best to push through each day. The drills, the duties, the constant vigilance. It all became a distraction, a way to focus his mind on something other than the dark memories of war that haunted him. Yet, there were times when those memories broke through, uninvited and unforgiving. The sound of marching, the scent of smoke in the air, and the silence that often followed a battle were all triggers that would send his mind racing back to those horrific moments. He had tried so many times to bury them, but it felt as though they were always just below the surface, waiting to emerge. James, on the other hand, continued his work with the same dedication he had always shown. To the rest of the guards, he was still the ideal image of the royal guard, strong, composed, and unwavering. But beneath his disciplined exterior, he too was carrying his own burdens. Over the years, he had learned how to suppress his grief, to bury it so deep that no one, not even his closest comrades, would know the pain he had been hiding. The loss of his brother, the memories of the war, and the constant pressure to maintain his image. These were things James had learned to live with, but they never fully left him. As time went on, James and Liam's connection grew stronger, though neither man openly acknowledged it. They continued to work alongside each other, their silent bond forming as they shared moments of quiet understanding. James, though still maintaining his role as a leader, began to watch Liam more closely. He could see the younger soldier struggling, the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes would flicker with unease when a loud noise or a sudden movement reminded him of the past. And while James had no words of comfort, he knew that sometimes, just being there for someone was enough. One chilly afternoon, as the soldiers prepared for a memorial ceremony to honor fallen comrades, Liam found himself standing in formation once again. The ceremony was an important event, and the guards were expected to be on their best behavior, their expressions neutral, their movements synchronized. As the names of the fallen soldiers were read aloud, Liam stood still, his hands clenched by his sides. He had participated in many memorials before, but today felt different. Today, it felt personal. As the ceremony went on, the names of soldiers from past conflicts filled the air, each one a reminder of the price of war. For most of the guards, it was a solemn but familiar tradition. But for Liam, each name seemed to stir something deep inside him. He could see the faces of his fallen comrades in his mind's eye, their smiles, their laughter, the way they had stood side by side with him on the front lines. And then he remembered the ones who hadn't made it out, the ones who had fallen in battle, their lives cut short in a way that felt both cruel and senseless. As the names continued to be read, Liam's chest tightened. His thoughts spiraled, and for a moment, he wasn't standing at attention in front of the royal palace. He was back on the battlefield, surrounded by smoke and chaos, hearing the shouts of his comrades and the screams of those who were too young to die. He could hear their voices in his head, feel their presence as if they were still with him, urging him to fight, to survive, to keep going. But he wasn't sure he had the strength left to keep going anymore. Liam's legs felt weak, his vision blurred, and his heart pounded in his chest. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his hands began to tremble. He could feel himself breaking, the emotions threatening to spill over. His body felt heavy, as if the memories were pressing down on him from all sides. For a split second, it was as if he were back in the thick of battle, trapped in the past, unable to escape. It was then that he felt it, an almost imperceptible pressure on his shoulder. He froze, surprised, not sure if he had imagined it. But when he looked to his left, there stood James, his hand resting firmly on his shoulder. For a moment, Liam's mind went blank. He couldn't believe it. James, the epitome of composure, had broken the unspoken rule. He had stepped out of formation, just enough to offer Liam the silent support he needed without saying a word. The gesture, so small, yet so powerful, hit Liam harder than anything else could have. In that simple, quiet moment, he felt understood. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel so alone in his pain. He wasn't just a soldier standing in a line anymore. He was a person, with emotions, with struggles, and someone had finally noticed. James didn't say a word, but his presence spoke volumes. His hand on Liam's shoulder was a silent reassurance, a message that he was there, that Liam didn't have to carry his burdens alone. The ceremony continued, but Liam felt a sense of calm slowly wash over him. The pressure in his chest eased, and his breath became more even. He wasn't sure how long they stood like that, him and James caught in a moment that spoke louder than any words could. It wasn't the kind of thing that was normally seen by the public or by the other guards. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. There was only the quiet understanding between them, a bond forged through shared experience and unspoken care. When the ceremony ended, the soldiers slowly began to disperse, returning to their duties. But James and Liam stayed in formation for a few extra moments. Liam turned his head slightly, catching James's eye. There was a flicker of something in the older man's gaze, something that made Liam feel a bit lighter, a bit less burdened. It wasn't a smile. James never smiled, at least not in public. But it was something more subtle, something that spoke of respect, of solidarity. Liam couldn't bring himself to say anything in that moment, but he felt a deep sense of gratitude. It was strange, this connection he had with James. It wasn't something he had expected when he first joined the guard. He had thought that strength was all that mattered, that showing emotion was a weakness. But now, he realized that strength wasn't just about holding it all in. Sometimes, strength came from allowing others in, from letting someone else help carry the weight. As the two men returned to their duties, neither of them said a word about what had happened. They didn't need to. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a silent agreement that they would look out for each other, even when no one else could see. And for Liam, that was enough. In the days that followed, he began to feel a shift inside him. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect, But the heavy weight that had settled in his chest for so long began to feel just a little lighter. The memories still haunted him. The pain still lingered. But now, he had someone who understood. Someone who didn't expect him to be perfect. Someone who knew that sometimes it was okay to show that you weren't okay. And that made all the difference. The weeks following the memorial ceremony were a turning point for Liam. There was a noticeable shift in him. Though the memories of war still lingered at the edges of his mind, they no longer felt as suffocating. He had moments where his mind wandered back to the front lines, but they were becoming less frequent, and when they came, they weren't as overwhelming as before. The tight grip of anxiety that had held him captive for so long was loosening, bit by bit, thanks to the quiet support of James. James, however, seemed to keep his distance, as he always had. It wasn't that he didn't care, far from it. But he knew the importance of allowing Liam to find his own way. While he had offered that silent comfort during the ceremony, he didn't want to intrude. The Royal Guard was a place where emotions were tightly controlled, and while he knew the burden of grief, he also understood that soldiers needed to maintain their composure. What James hadn't expected was how much that simple act of kindness would help Liam. In some ways, it was a reminder to him as well. No matter how strong someone appeared, they were still human, still vulnerable, still in need of understanding. One evening, as the two of them were cleaning their gear after a long day of training, James found himself thinking more about his own past. It wasn't something he liked to revisit, but seeing Liam struggle had brought memories rushing back, memories of his brother, of the long years that had passed since he had lost him. He had kept the pain buried for so long, locked away behind his disciplined exterior. But now, watching Liam slowly recover, something inside him shifted. Perhaps, in some quiet corner of his mind, he was beginning to see that his own emotions needed to be dealt with too. James had never really talked about his brother's death, and he certainly hadn't shared the weight it had left on his heart. It wasn't that he hadn't wanted to, it was more that, like so many others, he had believed that talking about it would make it real. It would mean admitting that the loss wasn't just something he could push aside. He had tried to convince himself that being a Royal Guard meant being above it all, that emotions had no place in the life he had chosen. But deep down, James knew that wasn't true. Emotions were part of what made him who he was. They shaped him, drove him, and though they had been buried under years of training, they still existed. Liam, too, was becoming more aware of the man standing beside him. Though James was still the picture of discipline and strength, there was a new depth to him, one that Liam hadn't noticed before. In the past, James had seemed unapproachable, almost like a figure to be admired from a distance but never truly understood. But now, there was something more human about him. Liam had started to notice small things, ways that James would look away when certain topics were discussed. The way his eyes would flicker just a little too long when someone mentioned loss or sacrifice. For the first time, Liam realized that James wasn't invincible. He was someone who had his own battles, his own scars, and though he had mastered the art of hiding them, they were there. One evening, as the two men sat in the mess hall, Liam found himself feeling unusually reflective. He had always kept to himself, never really opening up to anyone about his past or the struggles he had faced. But the weight of everything, the memories of war, the loneliness, the guilt was starting to feel unbearable. He couldn't keep hiding from it forever. And yet, he was unsure of how to begin. He had never talked about his experiences, not even with the men who had fought beside him. How could he start now? As if reading his thoughts, James spoke up, his voice quiet but steady. "Liam," he said, looking over at the younger soldier. "You've been quieter than usual lately. You know you can talk to me, right?" Liam's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to say. He had never expected James to speak so directly to him about it. He had assumed that James, like most of the other guards, would just continue on with his work, pretending that everything was fine. But here was this man, this figure of unshakable strength, offering a rare moment of vulnerability. Liam swallowed hard, unsure of where to begin. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's so much. I don't even know if I can talk about it." James's expression softened, his eyes filled with understanding. "You don't have to say everything all at once," he said. "But I want you to know that it's okay. You don't have to carry it alone. Not anymore." Liam hesitated. But then, something inside him broke free. The floodgates opened, and he found himself speaking, his words tumbling out in a rush. He talked about the battles he had fought, the men he had lost, the fear that had gripped him every time they went into battle. He spoke of the nights he couldn't sleep, the memories that haunted him in his dreams. He told James about his guilt, the guilt of surviving when others didn't, the guilt of not being able to do more, to save more lives. As he spoke, Liam felt a strange sense of release. It wasn't that the pain went away, it didn't. But talking about it made it feel less like something he had to carry alone. James didn't interrupt him, didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he listened. He just listened. And in doing so, he gave Liam the space to speak his truth. When Liam finished, the silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. James, though still composed, seemed to be processing everything Liam had said. It was clear that he had heard these words before, in one form or another, from soldiers who had been through similar experiences. But it was also clear that, in some way, James understood Liam's pain on a deeper level. He had lost people too. He had witnessed the horrors of war, and he had carried his own share of guilt and grief. After a long pause, James finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "I know what it's like," he said, his words filled with quiet conviction. "I've seen it too, and I've carried it with me, just like you. It's not easy, but we don't have to hide from it. Not anymore." Liam looked at him, surprised. He had never expected James to open up in this way. He had always seen James as a figure of strength, a man who never wavered, who never let emotions get in the way of duty. And yet, here he was, acknowledging the same pain that Liam had been carrying for so long. "You've been carrying this weight for a long time, haven't you?" James nodded slowly. "I have. But you don't have to carry it alone. None of us do." Liam felt a lump form in his throat. It was a simple statement, but it carried so much weight. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't just part of a team of soldiers. He was part of a brotherhood, a group of people who had each other's backs, who shared in both the triumphs and the losses. The Royal Guard was more than just duty and discipline. It was a place where soldiers could lean on each other, where they could find strength not just in themselves, but in the people standing beside them. "I'm sorry," Liam said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know how to let it out. I didn't know if I could." James gave him a reassuring smile, though it was small, almost imperceptible. "You don't need to apologize, Liam. We all carry our own burdens. But we don't have to carry them alone." The words hung in the air between them. A promise. A bond. It was a quiet, unspoken understanding that no matter what happened next, they were in this together. And for the first time in a long while, Liam felt a sense of peace. He wasn't alone anymore. He had someone who understood. In that moment, something shifted within him. The weight of his past wasn't gone, but it felt more manageable now. He wasn't going to let it define him. He wasn't going to carry it alone. He had the Royal Guard by his side. And more importantly, he had James. And that, in itself, made all the difference. As time passed, the relationship between James and Liam became more than just that of a mentor and student. It was one rooted in mutual respect, shared understanding, and an unspoken bond that only grew stronger with each passing day. The days of strict formality and cold distance were fading. replaced by something more human. Something that, while unspoken, was always present in their interactions. The Royal Guard, despite its rigid structure and unwavering expectations, had become a place where both men found a kind of quiet refuge. They still carried the weight of duty, but now, they carried it together. Liam's progress didn't happen overnight. There were still days when the past would creep back in, days when his mind would wander to the memories he'd tried so hard to forget. But something had shifted. When the dark thoughts came, he didn't have to face them alone anymore. There was a strength in knowing that he could reach out, that there were people who cared, people who had their own burdens, but were still there to help carry his. And James was the most important of those people. James, too, had begun to change. While he remained the unshakable leader that the Royal Guard depended on, his own walls had cracked in ways he hadn't expected. Over the years, he had perfected the art of keeping his emotions hidden. But through his quiet support of Liam, he had started to confront the grief he had long buried. He never spoke much about his brother or the pain he had carried for so long. But there was something healing in simply being there for someone else, in offering a steady presence, even when the past remained unspoken. It wasn't until one particularly cold morning that everything came to a head. The guard had been given a rare day off, a brief reprieve from their usual duties. It was a chance for the soldiers to rest and recharge before the next round of training and ceremonies. Liam, who had spent the past few weeks quietly navigating his own emotional landscape, found himself sitting in the barracks, staring out of the window at the gray sky. The world seemed so still, so silent. But within him, there was a storm, a swirl of emotions he wasn't sure how to navigate. James entered the room, his usual calm presence unmistakable. But there was something different about him today. There was a heaviness to his step, a look in his eyes that Liam immediately noticed. It was a kind of quiet sadness, one that wasn't immediately obvious but was there if you knew where to look. Liam sat up a little straighter as James approached, his concern growing. "Is everything all right, Corporal?" he asked carefully. His voice was tentative, as if unsure of whether he should ask or not. James didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a seat across from Liam, his movements slower than usual. It was almost as though the weight of something was pulling at him, something he hadn't let anyone see. For a long moment, they simply sat there in silence, the quiet of the room enveloping them both. Liam watched James closely, wondering what was on his mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James spoke. "It's been a long time since I've really thought about it," he said softly, his eyes fixed on the floor. "But I'm starting to realize that I can't keep burying it, not forever." Liam wasn't sure what James meant at first, but then, as the words settled in, he began to understand. James wasn't talking about his duties or the challenges of being a Royal Guard. He was talking about something much deeper, the grief, the loss, the emotions that he had spent years hiding beneath his disciplined exterior. "I lost someone," James continued, his voice low and steady, as if speaking the words aloud somehow made them more real. "A long time ago. My brother. We fought in the same unit. And he didn't make it back." He paused, as though the words were heavy on his tongue, like they were not his own, but rather the words of a stranger. "I've carried that with me, every day, and I've never really talked about it. Not to anyone. Not even to the other guards. I've always believed that if I just kept my head down, kept working, I could ignore it. But I can't anymore." Liam sat in stunned silence, the weight of James's words sinking in. He had known that James had lost someone in the past, but hearing it so plainly, hearing the pain behind the words, it was different. It made James more human, more real. And it made Liam realize how much they had in common. "You don't have to carry that alone, you know," Liam said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "None of us do." James looked up at him then, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "I've always believed that," he said, his voice steady, but tinged with emotion. "I've always believed that the guard was a place where we could rely on each other. But I never really let anyone in. Not until now. Not until you." Liam felt a rush of warmth, the kind that came from knowing that he wasn't just the one being helped, that he wasn't the only one who had needed someone to lean on. James had been carrying his own weight all along, just as Liam had. But now, they were no longer alone in their struggles. "We're in this together," Liam said, his voice firm, filled with a sense of resolve that he hadn't known he was capable of. "We don't have to face it alone." James nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, you're right," he said, his tone softening. "It's just hard to admit sometimes, you know, that even we have our limits." Liam chuckled lightly. "I think we all forget that sometimes. But it's okay to have limits. We're human. And it's okay to ask for help." James seemed to reflect on that for a moment before leaning back in his chair, his usual composure slowly returning. But there was a change in him, something that had shifted deep inside. It wasn't just the weight of duty he was carrying now. It was the knowledge that he didn't have to hide anymore. He didn't have to be perfect, because perfection wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the connection, the understanding, and the strength they found in one another. After that conversation, something in both men changed. The unspoken bond between them deepened, becoming a foundation of support and trust that neither had expected, but both now understood. James continued to be the steady figure that everyone in the Royal Guard looked up to, but now, there was a new layer to him. A humanity that made him even more powerful in the eyes of those who truly knew him. And Liam, no longer trapped by his own pain, began to find a sense of peace he had never known before. The rest of the guard began to notice the change in Liam. He was no longer the quiet, withdrawn soldier he had once been. There was a new confidence in his steps, a steadiness in his gaze. He was still the same soldier, still committed to his duties, but now he carried something else. The understanding that he didn't have to face everything alone. James, too, seemed lighter, though his stoic exterior remained. The other guards continued to respect him as their leader. But those who truly saw him, those like Liam, knew that there was more to him than just the perfect soldier. And in that, there was strength. In the days that followed, James and Liam continued to serve together, side by side, each day a little easier, a little more meaningful. They knew that the path ahead wouldn't always be easy, that there would still be days of doubt, of struggle, of pain. But they also knew that they had each other, and that was enough. In a world where the Royal Guard was a symbol of unwavering strength and discipline, they had found something even more powerful: human connection. And with that connection, they knew they could face anything that came their way. Together.